Recording.
Yes.
Okay, we're here. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
I'm Jen, and this is Carolina. And am I saying that right? I meant to ask that before. Okay,
yes,
thank
Carolina.
you. We're here today to talk about parenting as a HSP and parenting HSP children, because I feel like it's a kind of two-pronged situation. But before we get started, I just want to do a bit of an intro as to who we are while we're here. So I'm coming to you live from the beachside town of Exmouth, Western Australia, in my caravan, because for the last 7 months, my fiance and I have been traveling around Western Australia and basically living and working on the road, which is really exciting. And I think a lot of HSPs have told me they'd love to do it. So that's why I like sharing that, because I feel like it is relevant to our audience. So that's also why my background isn't as pretty as what Carolina's is, for example, because I'm literally sitting in my caravan. So, but yeah, so that's where I'm coming from. And Carolina's joining us from Napa in California. And we were just talking about how cool it is to be able to do this, so that we've got Australia and the US talking, and it's not really new anymore. And I think COVID has kind of normalized this sort of thing, like catching up on Zoom has become almost the new normal. But I still think it's cool that we get to connect with people from literally all over the world. And we're here today because I decided I wanted to host the first ever HSP Extrovert Awareness Week. And the purpose of this week is twofold. One, because those who know me know that I'm very passionate about showing HSP extrovert women how amazing they are and helping them live into their strengths and seeing their sensitivity as a superpower. So that's one purpose, is to kind of celebrate being HSP extrovert. And the second purpose is to help raise awareness and to help educate our loved ones, because a lot of the time, well, most HSPs live in a world where we're not understood. So I thought, well, who better to educate our loved ones than us? And I know some of my ladies have said things like, oh, how do I explain it? Or what do I do when this happens? So I thought, well, maybe it's up to me to try and provide some of that education. So that's kind of why we're here. And I thought Carolina would be a perfect guest to bring on, because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of HSPs are raising HSP children, and most of us in our generation, I think, grew up thinking that something was wrong with us, because HSP is a relatively new discovery. Obviously, we've been around for who knows how long, but we haven't had the language to talk about it. So I think now is the perfect opportunity for HSPs to raise a generation of HSP children who see it as a blessing and see it as a gift, as opposed to, and it being normalized, as opposed to us thinking, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with me. And it's not till we get to our 40s or our 50s that we go, oh, okay, yep, I'm liking this. So I think it's an opportunity to change the face of the world for HSP children. And the second prong of the parenting aspect is parenting as an HSP. I don't know, because I don't have any children. I've got stepchildren through Warren and now step-grandchildren, which makes me feel really old. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. But I imagine parenting as a HSP is very challenging. And even, I mean, parenting full stop is challenging, but I think parenting as a HSP would be even more challenging. So that's why I wanted Carolina to come along and share her wisdom and her experience with us. So just a little bit about her. So Carolina Mariposa is an HSP mum and the founder of Butterfly Grove. I love that name, by the way, where she provides intuitive guidance to empower highly sensitive children ages 0 to 21 and their parents. Intuitive guidance is coaching which combines energy healing techniques with practical strategies Carolina has acquired over the past 20 years as a child and family therapist and early childhood mental health specialist. The inclusion of energy healing techniques is often the missing link for highly sensitive kids and parents, as it provides unique insight into our personal patterns and the relational dynamics within the family, including the subtle ways that our sensitivities impact each family member. Having this insight, children, teens, and their parents are empowered to validate each other's experiences and grow even closer. Love that. So for more information, please visit the Butterfly Grove website. I'll post that in the comments in the video later, but it's butterflygrovehsp.com. There are links there to Carolina's YouTube channel, Facebook page, Instagram, blog posts, and so then you can find additional resources for sensitive kids and their parents. So that's Carolina. So I'm going to, before I hand over to her, I'm just going to remind people, if you are watching us live, and please excuse me, I'm going to be checking my phone as we go through this just to see if there's any comments from people. But if you are watching us live, we'd love you to jump on the comments and say hi and let us know where you're watching this from, because I love seeing how far around the world it goes. Even if you're watching the recording, I would love for you to jump on and say hi in the comments and let us know where you're watching us from. Please let us know your thoughts as we go through. If you're resonating with what we're saying, definitely let us know if you have any questions, even if you're watching the replay, because Carolina and I will circle back and answer any questions that come through via the comments later on. So Carolina, over to you. If you would like to share with us kind of your story, like when did you find out you were HSP? How did you kind of get into what you're doing now?
Okay, yeah, I'd love to. Thank you again for having me. I'm so excited to do this. And my journey as an HSP actually started alongside my intuitive training. So I went through a medical intuitive training program. I started in 1999, so over 20 years ago. And my teacher, Francesca McCartney, talked a lot about sensitive people in our training, and she recommended Dr. Aaron's book. So at that point, I knew I was sensitive, but I didn't know that it was a thing. I didn't know that it was defined and that there was research about it. And I didn't actually read the book right away because I was so kind of submerged in the experience of the training. But when I decided to go to graduate school to become a therapist, that's when I read the book. I started to do that, I think 3 or 4 years after my intuitive training. And then I had even more light bulbs than I'd had during my intuitive training. So what I love about the fact that I learned about it in my intuitive training is that it really normalized sensitivity, and it gave me really concrete tools to both understand it and work with it, because I heard your story the other day about the light around, the protection light that you put around yourself. And tools like that are abundant when you're studying medical intuition or energy healing. And so I had so many ways to understand my sensitivity, to be able to perceive energy that was coming in and send it out if it wasn't helpful for me. And I think a lot of people who are intuitive, they're getting, highly sensitive people get a lot of information anyway. And then if you're intuitive in any way, you're perceiving energy, whether you're clairvoyant or you're empathic or you hear people's thoughts, or however you're intuitive, it's just another layer on the HSP spectrum. And what I found is that the more that I've studied it and the more I've practiced my intuitive skills, the more it's almost like you open a Pandora's box and you just realize how much information you're getting, and how much work we all have to do to screen it out. Like we read the research about it, but to actually experience that, to walk into a room and not only be able to sense the emotions or the mood of the room, but also to get clairvoyant information or get, tingling up your spine. And it's such a rich experience to be an HSP, and it can be overwhelming, but the energy healing really gives a lot of concrete tools. So I was a therapist working with children and families for the last 20 years. I mentioned I went to grad school a few years later, and I really did that in a way to kind of legitimize my sensitivity. And that may sound weird, but I felt like just being an intuitive at that time wasn't quite legit enough for the real world. I imagine
it would have been very woo-woo, I imagine, because it still is a little bit, but back then it would have been even more so. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, so I went and got clinical training and really worked a lot with children and families of all sorts. And so along the way, I recognized how high sensitivity was playing into a lot of the challenges the families were having that I was working with. And I was able to introduce Dr. Aaron's research and educate them about the trait. And what I love about what I'm doing now is that I also can bring those intuitive skills to my clients, because I feel like it's such an empowering way for them to deal with it. It's a very proactive way of being in the world to manage your energy on a regular basis. And kids especially, they learn it so quickly. And so I've just been amazed at how, like, I had a session today with someone who's 11, and she got it. Like, she wasn't grounded when she came in, and she was grounded when she left. And I was like, it takes some adults like 10 years to learn how to ground. And she just did it in one session. Like, she's amazing. So I love that added information that I can share with people and those additional tools. And I love that I also have the sort of more practical, legit background, because then if they have other questions about the relationships or kind of more mundane things, I can offer information about that too. So like you, I'm super passionate about just changing life for HSP kids. I feel like the next generation has the potential to just, I mean, I don't even think we can imagine the amazing things they'll accomplish. And my own daughter is, I believe, in HSP. She's only 2, but it's pretty clear that she is, and she's definitely more of an extrovert than I am. So I think I'm raising an HSP-E, which is pretty exciting. And so I'm also excited to just be here learning from you as well, because I'm going to have some tools to give her as she grows.
Fabulous. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And because before we jumped on live, Carolina and I were talking about that, how a lot of pretty much all the stuff out there is geared towards highly sensitive introverts. And that's kind of not a criticism, and it's not anybody's fault. It just is the way it is, because 70% of HSPs are introverts. So because what my ladies share with me is even therapists or people working with HSPs, there's that kind of assumption that they're all similar, whereas the HSP extroverts will say to you, well, that doesn't resonate with me, that doesn't make sense to me, because there are some quite significant differences. And that comes from the added part of our brain, which is extrovert. And so those who have followed me for a while, you would know that I call us walking contradictions, because we literally do have almost 2 personalities within us that contradict each other. So our in a nutshell, our extrovert likes going out extroverting and getting external stimulation and meeting new people, doing new things. And then guess what? HSP self goes, overwhelm, overstimulation, freaks out, needs time out. So HSP extroverts, that's probably the biggest battle we have, is that ongoing kind of finding a way to respect both those sides of our personality. And I think that's probably the one thing that I would say is key for all HSP extroverts, even for your daughter, is teach her to kind of respect that we have those contradictory needs. And the way I kind of visualize it in my head is like on a seesaw. So one side is our extrovert side and the other side is our HSP side. And if one of them gets too high, it needs to kind of come back down to balance. And then the other one might go up too high. And so it's about trying to find that balance, which isn't a destination. It's not somewhere that you can kind of get to and you're like, right, I'm done. I've found the balance. It's an ongoing battle. And I think that's probably the one thing that I would share with all HSP introverts in terms of how to understand HSP extroverts better. That's probably the key difference, I would suggest. So yeah, I love that the universe connected us, because hopefully my stuff can help with your daughter. So cool. Thank you. So just before we go into some of the topics that I wanted Carolina to talk about, I thought I'd just share my story in terms of where this idea from, where me wanting to talk about parenting came from. So most of us know that there's a thing called vantage sensitivity with HSPs. So we are more affected by both positive and negative experiences than non-HSPs. So unfortunately, what that means is HSPs who grow up with a less than ideal childhood end up more damaged than a non-HSP growing up with the exact same circumstances. But on the plus side, and I always make sure I add this bit in, on the plus side, we can also benefit much quicker, and interventions are much more effective on us because of that vantage sensitivity. So if you do grow up in a less than ideal childhood, then there's lots you can do to overcome the challenges that go with that. And it's what I call becoming an evolved HSP. So that's living into your strengths. So that's just something. And so knowing that, that's why I think this topic is so powerful, because we do literally have the opportunity to change the world for HSP children. So I was very, very lucky growing up in that I had fabulous parents. My dad's a psychologist. My mum gave up her career to raise us, which I thought was such a beautiful thing that she did. She was HSP extrovert, I'm pretty sure, as well. She's no longer with us, sadly, so I haven't been able to have these conversations with her. She died quite young, but that's a whole nother story. So I was very, very blessed, and I had a very blessed childhood. But even that, I still had challenges. And I think it came from just because Elaine Aron talks about the challenges that we have as HSPs. It's not because of us, it's because we're growing up in a world that is not set up for sensitives. It's set up for busy, crazy, everybody's overwhelmed, everybody's trying to do too much. So the world is just not set up for us. So that's why we have these challenges. If the world changed, we potentially wouldn't have these challenges and other people might have challenges instead. So I think that's an interesting way to look at it. So because I think that helps ensure that we don't think it's us. So yeah, I was very blessed growing up. But if the thing that I think would have really shifted things is the gift of mum and dad knowing about HSP and how to help raise a HSP child. I think that would have been the icing on the cake, because as I said, I was very, very lucky, and I do feel very grateful that I was born to the parents that I was born to, but I still had the issues growing up. I still knew that there was something wrong with me. I still was very affected by the usual bitchiness at high school and the bullying and things like that. So that's why I think this topic is so important, because it's relevant for all HSP children, whether they're growing up in non-ideal childhoods, ideal childhoods. Obviously, probably the only parents who are going to be listening to this are the ones who want to create an ideal childhood. So I don't know how we get to the other ones, but that's a topic for another day. So yeah, that's my story, and that's why I thought this topic was so important, because I think it's relevant for everybody. So Carolina, if you can share with us what in your experience do you think are some of the biggest challenges for HSP parents?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So I think the number one biggest challenge is not enough downtime, especially if you have more than one kid. I know that I just have one and I struggle to find enough downtime. I actually have made a point of waking up an hour and a half before my daughter so that I can have my alone time each day, even though sometimes it means I'm a little tired. So I think, and I remember one mom who I worked with, she had a fairly new baby and just said, it's just so incessant. Like, does that make me a bad person? It's just, I never get a break. Even when she's asleep, there's something to do and there's things to think about. And so I think that's the number one in my experience. And I think another challenge that all parents face, but that HSPs, I think, struggle with more just because of our nature, is when there's not a goodness of fit in the temperaments between us and our children. So I feel really lucky that I'm an HSP with an HSP daughter, but even I struggle with the fact that I'm more introverted and she's more extroverted, and I have to kind of push myself to give her more extroverted experiences than I'm necessarily comfortable with. So I think it's that, but there are some people who are huge mismatch. You know, they're an HSP kid and they're not an HSP parent, so they just don't really get it at all. And that can just result in a lot of conflicts and misunderstandings. And like you said, kids just feeling like something's wrong with them. And I think any conscientious parent is going to want to look at themselves and what they can do to learn about their child, but also learn about themselves so that they can help their child understand that that everyone has a process, right? Like I know with my daughter, when I take her out and we do a bunch of activities, I have to tell her, even though she's 2, like, I need you to go spend time with your dad right now so that mama can just have a half hour just to decompress, because that was a lot for me, where she's just jazzed and wants to keep talking to people. So it's knowing yourself is really important, I think, in addressing those, but that is one of the hardest things, is when there's not that goodness of fit, and it results in misunderstandings or conflicts.
Definitely. And I imagine, because I'm just trying to think of some of the combos. So I imagine, yeah, for you, it would be super exhausting because you've got the HSP in common, which helps. But
Yes.
because she's the extrovert, then that adds to that exhaustion and that overstimulation factor. I imagine probably one of the worst combos would be a HS introvert parent with a non-HSP extrovert child. I imagine that would be very, very difficult. Would you agree with that?
I would totally agree. Yeah. And I think because HSP parents are so conscientious, we're going to beat ourselves up more than we're going to make our kids suffer for that difference. But it still is really hard and it's really painful, and can result in those conflicts. And a lot of, like, one of the gifts of being an HSP parent is that you can really attune to who your child is, because we're so used to paying attention to every little thing that everybody does. And so we're going to know our kids really well. And then we're going to have to stretch sometimes when there's that mismatch, to really give them what they need. But yeah, I worked with some parents. I worked in the foster care system for a while, with foster and adoptive kids as a therapist. But what I saw there was that mismatch happened a lot, where you would have a foster parent who just, had a kid for a short amount of time. And the foster parent was, possibly one way very strongly. And the child just had so many other needs that they didn't understand and couldn't meet. So a lot of my job then was also just education. Like, well, your foster child needs this because of this experience, and naturally they seem sensitive, or, I try to get to know the child and then be their voice or their advocate with that parent.
Yeah. And I think, and I'm guessing in the US, it's probably similar to in Australia, the system would be so stretched that you wouldn't have the opportunity to perhaps get a better match. It's kind of like you've got to work with what you've got because there's a lack of parents around. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I just want to say, so we've got Veronique. Hello. Veronique's joined us from, pretty sure she's in Massachusetts. And Veronique
my home state.
Oh, there you go.
I grew up in Massachusetts. So hi, Veronique.
So Veronique is, she's one of the ones who inspired me to invite you on, actually.
Oh, great.
Because Veronique, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your at least one of your kids is HSP. So Veronique is very new to discovering she's a HSP extrovert.
Okay.
And so she's obviously, and she's a conscientious parent, as most HSPs would be. So she's looking, and Veronique, I noticed you comment, you haven't missed any advice yet. We've kind of just been talking about the biggest challenges for HSP parents. So she said her HSP introvert daughter is just turning 15. So just based on what you said, I just wanted to come back to that, because I think the key in what you've just said about being a good parent as a HSP or of a HSP child is, it sounds like self-awareness. And because this is something that keeps coming up recently. And I think self-awareness, I was talking about it in Connection Corner the other day, my group coaching membership. I think that's kind of probably that, if I had to say there was a number one skill that you could foster and develop in terms of improving your life? I would say it was self-awareness, and we were talking about that in Connection Corner. And I feel like it's just come up again now in that, and because it came up in my talk with Sarah when we're talking about empaths,
Right.
it was all about self-awareness, being aware of when you're being impacted by energy. So would you say that that's right in terms of parenting as well, that self-awareness of when you need to push past your comfort zone, and that self-awareness of what's going on for you, so that you can say, like you did to your daughter, go hang out with daddy because I need a break, kind of thing? So would you say that's a key skill?
Absolutely. And I think what it extends into, which is really important, especially when you have younger kids, but really all ages, is the ability to not only notice what's going on with you, but regulate yourself emotionally. And I see 9 times out of 10, the conflicts that families are having with each other are because the parents get really amped up in response to their kid getting amped up, or they get upset because their kid's upset, or their kid is anxious, and so the parent's anxious, and they're just feeding on each other versus being able to regulate their own emotions and model that for their child. So it is why I like working with a whole family, because I feel like some people, not usually HSPs, but some people will bring their kid to a service like mine and say, we'll just fix them. But usually what is more helpful is if the parent learns the skills at the same time, or at least, around the same time as their child does. And then they're able to have increased self-awareness and increased ability to regulate their own emotions and notice when they're escalating a situation, because kids really look to us to regulate ourselves, that they can't really regulate yet because they don't have those skills. So they expect us to do it for them in a way, and then they're able to learn how to do it for themselves. So
it's a modeling thing, isn't it? If we're not doing it, then they can't learn it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't know if any of your listeners have heard about polyvagal theory, and the idea that our nervous systems kind of co-regulate with each other, so that it really translates well to any kind of coaching or therapy, because the idea is that the coach is kind of the regulating force for the parent, who's then the regulating force for the child. And everybody, you need to have someone in the room who's able to be calm and regulated in order for their own nervous system that's jacked up to come down to a more settled state. So very important stuff.
And I think that's key for, I think, all human beings, that self-regulation you're talking about, because this ties into something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm going to talk about it in one of the other sessions, is people out there who are hypersensitive. Essentially, they haven't learned to manage their emotions, using the term HSP to kind of as an excuse for their behavior. And it's something that I'm not going to get started on, because I get up on my soapbox and I could go on forever.
I get that. I've seen that too. Yeah.
So it's something that I'm trying to change. And I think what you said about self-regulation is so relevant, because the self-awareness comes first, because if we're not aware, then we can't regulate. So I think that's why I kind of highlighted that. I think that's the key skill for all human beings, but in particular HSPs, is having that self-awareness, because once you're aware, then you can do something about it. So that's where the self-regulation of the emotions comes in, and your nervous system, as you were talking about. And I think that is really, really key to becoming an evolved HSP, because that is what takes you out of that, I'm a HSP and I can't help it kind of thing. It takes you out of that. It gives you your power back, so that you can actually change your experience of life. You can stop dumping your HSP stuff on other people, because that does happen in what I call unevolved HSPs. Like, oh, well, I'm just like that, you just have to put up with it. I'm like, well, not quite. So I think I just wanted to highlight that point, that self-regulation, I think, is so key, definitely when you're a parent, but even just for HSPs in everyday life. every human, I think, needs to learn it, but HSPs in particular, because our nervous systems and our emotions tend to run us a lot of the time. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I just wanted to see what Veronique said, because she said she's struggling, so you could probably help with this.
Okay.
So she says, I'm struggling with, so this is the HSP introvert daughter who's just turning 15. Veronique is struggling with how much of her introversion is typical teen rejecting time with parents, how much is her coping with the recent divorce, and how much is just her introversion and her HSP. So are you able to speak to that?
I'll try. Yeah, not knowing all the specifics, but I think definitely what I look for is how, if there's negative impacts across their day-to-day life. So if they're withdrawing not only from mom and dad, but also from all their friends, if they're looking more depressed or they're just acting more irritable or emotionally reactive, that's a sign that you need some help usually, versus just being a kind of typical moody teenager. It sounds like there's some significant stressors with the divorce that would certainly cause her to want to withdraw to some extent, just to manage her own process and her own emotions. Because with an introvert, that's what you do. You kind of sort it out on your own. But I tend to encourage even introverted families or introverted kids to try to at least communicate their process to somebody, so that there's clear communication. Because a lot of times some HSP introvert kids have it pretty well together. They're going through their process. They're functioning pretty well at school. They're maybe talking to some of their close friends or another relative besides mom or dad. And so they're coping okay. But they still, because they've withdrawn from their primary relationships, their mom and their dad, whoever's in the couple that's separating, the parent's going to be worried if they don't know what's going on. That's kind of always the case, especially a conscientious HSP parent. So it's helpful to for the parent to inquire, like, well, how is your process going? Are you feeling overwhelmed by everything? Are you feeling like you need some help, or do you feel like you've got it? And then really paying attention not only to their answer, because sometimes they're truthful and sometimes they're not, because they're teenagers, but also just their behavior intermittently, because I think they don't know if they're struggling. You're going to be able to see it, and you're going to know in your gut that something's not quite right with your kid. So you need to trust that, as well as trying to just open the communication. But when there is a situation like a divorce, it's often helpful for a kid to have someone else to talk to, just because the parents are so activated themselves around the separation. Does that answer, Varen? Is that helpful, or there's a subsequent?
Yeah, let
question.
us know, Veronique, if that's good, or if you've got more stuff. And a couple of things I wanted to highlight in what you said, Carolina, is first of all the processing. In introvert processing, as I say, I'm talking like you now, picking up your accent. And I know that one of the reasons Veronique's probably struggling with that is because extroverts, we process through talking aloud. So her daughter is obviously an internal processor. So I imagine that's part of where the struggle comes. Is Veronique would prefer her daughter to be more verbal, but obviously that's not how she's wired. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was, I've just lost my train of thought. Verbal processing. Anyway, I might come back to that. Veronique said yes, helpful. Thank you. So thank you. So what was I talking about? Yeah, verbal processes. I'll come back to it if I remember. Self-regulation, no. Damn, I knew I should have taken a note.
Was the other thing I talked about was just that how they're functioning in their day-to-day life.
Oh,
Was
yes. You said trust your gut. I want to thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, trust your gut.
Trust your gut, because that's another thing that HSPs often don't do. So one of our strengths is our intuition, because we're taking in so much of the world. So our subconscious kind of knows more than what we give it credit for a lot of the time. So I think that's really key, what you said as well, is trust your gut, because your gut knows. And one of the things that my Connection Corner ladies have kind of been saying is, well, how do you tell the difference between your intuition and worry or being triggered, or that sort of stuff? So, and one of the things that we talked about is our intuition is kind of that quiet little sense, whereas a trigger or worry is much louder. So that's, if that helps anybody who is trying to get in touch with their intuition. So I think that's really key, is trust your gut. If you think that something is up, then you're probably right, because you're a HSP, but just be mindful that it's not just worry or overthinking that's kind of come into play. So Veronique says, yes. So she said, yes, about how she expects her to verbally process and she doesn't. Yeah. So thank you for those tips, because I'm sure that was really helpful to Veronique. So Veronique, let us know if you've got any other questions. And there's also somebody else watching us live. So I'd love for you to say hi and let us know if you have any questions or any comments as we go. So Veronique has just said she does say that she's very content with her solitude between a year of COVID and then the teen retreat and divorce. Veronique, is being hyper vigilant, which would make sense. So perhaps you could talk to that, Carolina, as well, the impact that it's obviously having on Veronique, and then therefore her parenting because of the COVID, teen retreat, divorce.
Yeah, that's a lot of stress for mom too. I'm glad she has you to support her.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that, everyone has struggled on some level with COVID. And I imagine, I know for introverts, in some ways, it's been a blessing to be shut in and not having to make a lot of plans. But extroverts have had a lot of challenges with that. And I have a few extrovert friends who've talked to me about how kind of depressed and irritable they were during COVID. And even now that it's sort of there's a light at the end of the tunnel, it's hard to kickstart themselves back into normal, because everyone is still dealing with a lot of different stressors. And so I want to say I feel a lot of compassion for Veronique and all the parents out there, because it's not only just COVID and worrying about your kid getting sick. I mean, I'm sure there's been, the online school, and I mean, there's just been endless ways that this has been stressful for parents and their kids. And so I'm not surprised that a lot of us are looking for help now. Even as it's like the light is shining, people are still feeling like they're struggling and don't have all the answers. So
yeah,
I think
perhaps the light shining is almost highlighting, okay, now we want to do something about it. Because I think while we're kind of still in it, we're in the muck, we're in the depths of it, we can't necessarily see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's almost just like a survival instinct kicking in. We've just got to get through. Whereas now that the light at the end of the tunnel has kind of become a bit more visible, I think that's when we can start to look forward and go, okay, well, what can I do to pull myself out of this? So I think that's probably why more people are potentially looking for help now, because the light at the end of the tunnel is there, and they're able to perhaps look a bit more positively into the future. And Veronique has said she'd like to learn more about the program that you offer, wondering if it may be a way to find communication between her and her daughter. She said her daughter's spoken with a therapist with Zoom, but I would like to learn how to better communicate and understand and relate to her. So is that something your program would assist with?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. The beauty of what I'm doing now, running my own business versus I worked with a government agency doing mental health services before, is that I can pretty much tailor it to whatever people want and need. So I do have packages that are specific numbers of sessions for different things. But even if that feels like it's not quite right for a parent, I can talk with them about a different number of sessions, or what specific goals they're looking for, and kind of get a sense of the challenges, and give my estimate of how long it would take or how many sessions it would take. So, and I really like a combination of working with the youth alone and the parent alone, and then working with them together. I feel like that's really helpful for each to have their own space and kind of ways to process, and then also coming together in some of the sessions to learn the skills and practice them with each other. Because our closest relationships are the ones that trigger us the most, and where everything sort of comes up. And so it's the best place to practice. She may be having stuff come up with friends or other people, but if it's with her mom, it's going to be that much more transformative, I think, for her to be able to practice and the skills, and also learn, new communication tools to really connect more. Because that's what we all want, is to connect more with our kids. We want them to know how much we love them. We want them to know how important they are and how amazing they are. So yeah, I encourage her to get in touch with me on my website.
Okay, sounds good. Awesome. Thank you. Because she just said her son, so the older brother, is very open and communicative. So it's the contrast between the two that I think is also adding to Veronique's perhaps angst, is that is just so different between them. So yeah, Veronique, get in touch with Carolina. And we've got a special offer at the end of today's talk, which I'll talk about at the end. So stay tuned for that. And so I'm going to get on to the next topic, but those that are watching us live or on the recording, please feel free to keep commenting, keep asking questions, and I'll just keep checking them. But the next thing I wanted Carolina to touch on is, do you have any tips to tell if your child is HSP? Because obviously they get to a certain age and they could potentially do the test, the online test, which, as we know, still isn't like totally accurate. Like Dr. Aaron herself says that the DOES criteria are more accurate to assess yourself against, rather than even her own self-test. So I just wanted to say that that's why I did the intro, the discovery session on the DOES, because I think reading the DOES doesn't necessarily mean everybody understands the DOES criteria. So I've tried to break it down in a lot of detail for people. So obviously, kids can get to a certain point where they could use the self-tests and you can talk to them about DOES. But before that, do you have some tips as to, like, how do you tell, is my child HSP?
Absolutely. Yeah, I just wrote a blog post about 0 to 3 HSPs and kind of how you can tell. So I encourage people to check that out.
Cool.
On Julie Bian's website. But some of the things that you typically see are, the DOES criteria is a great reference. I agree with that. And I think the way it manifests in younger children is that they are going to have more meltdowns typically than other kids. I've met so many parents who just think, oh, well, she's just 2, or she's just 4, or he's 4. And so of course they're going to have meltdowns, but they're having like 2 or 3 a day. And that actually isn't normal. It's a sign that they're very reactive to things that are happening in their lives and in their environment. And so if your child is really emotional reactive, that's one. And also if they tend to withdraw a lot, that's another. And there's kind of a continuum of emotional responses, from dissociation on one end, which can look like spacing out and just disconnecting from the environment. And then what we think of as a more typical meltdown, really maybe a kid's getting aggressive or angry or throwing things. So that it's a pretty wide range of types of emotional responses. And the kids that tend to dissociate and space out on the other end, they're going to withdraw more. They're going to be internalizing more. So you want to, there's so many nuances. It's hard to kind of talk about all of them, but I'd say their tendency to approach or withdraw from new situations and different types of people is one thing you want to look at. If they tend to hold back, if they tend to observe, especially a lot of the HSP kids that I've met, they people they use the term the stink eye, like, yeah, she gives all these people the stink eye, or he, like, they just really check people out. They don't just, say hi, they really check people out. So that's another one in kind of newer situations or with new people. And then just in terms of sensory overload, you can tell pretty quickly, generally, if a kid is overloaded in one or more of their senses, and hopefully they're able to articulate, or you're able to notice enough if it's happening when they're really young that they're showing a startle response, or an upset response after a loud noise or in a really bright room. But not everybody thinks of the sensory things right away. So that's actually usually where I start. If someone comes to me and has a kid who's really reactive, I'll ask about what they observe and their different sensory sensitivities and try to do some investigation with the parent on that. So, and as they get older, the emotional reactivity is going to be more prominent, and they're hopefully also going to be able to tell you more what their experience is. And if you can go with that, the does criteria, it's really helpful to watch for, have those in your mind or have it as a reference at home, and really look at how your kid is behaving with each of those. So, and I would say, the depth of processing, that's usually the stink eye or the checking things out. Or just some kids will freeze too if there's just too much going on around them. So that's a few.
Awesome. Yeah, very, very helpful. Thank you. Yeah. And again, if you aren't sure, you can always reach out to Carolina and she can help you work through it. So the next one I wanted to chat about is the biggest mistakes you see parents of HSP children making. And this isn't a criticism of anybody, and I don't actually have anybody in mind, obviously, but I don't want it to come across as, oh, don't do this, but just in your experience, what are some of the mistakes and because I'm sure it comes from a place of wanting to do the right thing, because most HSP parents, I imagine, would be conscientious, as you say. But yeah, what are some of the mistakes that you see parents of HSP children making?
I think the biggest one is one you've talked about, which is the sort of minimizing or dismissing the child's reactions to their sensitivity, the way they demonstrate it, so that they think there's something wrong with them. Being told you're too sensitive, or being told just, oh, get over that, or just keep going. If they show some trepidation on the playground, just go, rather than giving them a moment to kind of take it all in and decide how they want to proceed. And I think along with that may also be we have our own expectations of our kids. And so we have our dreams of how we hope they're going to be. And so if we have a kid who doesn't want to play with other kids when there's 20 kids on the playground, but is okay when there's just one or two, but we really, really want them to be able to go and play with those 20 kids, we're going to have to do our own work around that, managing those expectations. So I think looking at where those come from in ourselves, and because oftentimes HSP parents, if they're not tuning in accurately to their kids, or even if they're not HSP, it's often because they're not tuning into something in themselves. Like it's almost a mirror situation. So if the parent is one to dismiss their own reactions or their own emotions, or feel they're too sensitive, then they're going to be passing that on to their kids sometimes. So we keep going back to this, but that self-awareness is so important in making sure that we're not doing that kind of harm to our kids. I often, I talk to my husband a lot about my own process, and just like, I want so much to have integrity with our daughter. Like, I don't want to project anything onto her. I don't want her to feel like I'm working stuff out on her. Like, I just want her to be a kid and just be who she is. And a lot of us want that, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of vigilance.
Yeah. And I imagine, do you come across, this is something just occurred to me. I imagine because a lot of HSPs have perfectionist tendencies and
Mhm.
they do you come across a lot of parents who perhaps are maybe a little hard on themselves in terms of the job that they're doing, and they're perhaps doing a pretty good job in, because most HSPs are relatively self-aware and most of them are quite conscientious. So, oh, I think a bee has just come into my caravan.
Saw that.
Let's try not to let that come near me again. I have a tendency to get stung by bees. Warren will tell you
Oh
every time we
no.
go away. I'm not allergic, but they just, I don't know, I just end up stepping on them or something. But yeah, anyway, sorry, I got distracted. So yeah, is that a common thing you find, that they're kind of beating themselves up even though they're doing a pretty good job in comparison to perhaps the rest of the world?
Absolutely. Yes. And thank you for bringing that up, because more than anything, they want to be good for their kid. You know, they want to be the best they can be for their kid. And I think sometimes it's harsh judgment on themselves. And sometimes they're just so overwhelmed that that's why they're harshly judging themselves. Like they don't give themselves any slack. So yeah, I encourage parents to be really gentle with themselves and have a lot of compassion, because we all do mean well, you know, especially HSPs, where most of us are really conscientious, good people. And sometimes it's helpful in using my intuitive skills to just look at the objective energy of a situation. So a parent might be saying, oh, this happened and this happened and this happened, and it was so awful for my kid, and the kid's energy actually looks okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a helpful tool in my work that I can say, you know, I'm actually getting that she was okay, and maybe this is more about you needing to be gentle with yourself and cut yourself some slack. So I'm able to have that perspective when it's necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fabulous. Yeah, thank you. And I think the other thing to remember is that vantage sensitivity as well. So even though you don't want to harm your child in any way, if you inadvertently don't get it right, which I'm sure all parents are going to do at some point, because none of us are perfect, and to put that sort of pressure on yourself is just crazy. So remember, the vantage sensitivity is to undo any kind of inadvertent slip up or whatever is easier with a HSP child, because they're going to benefit from those positive interventions and from those positive experiences that you can add to kind of help them overcome any of those challenges. So yeah, I think that's really good advice. Be kind to yourself, which I think again is it's kind of like a universal thing for HSPs, is to remember to be kind to yourself, to have compassion, because we do put a lot of pressure on ourselves. And I imagine as a parent that's kind of magnified because there's another person involved that you're so in love with, that you want to do the best for. Yeah, so it's a lot of extra pressure, so it's important to be careful of that pressure you're putting on yourself.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, when in my early childhood mental health work, we learned that if a child is attended to appropriately, you know, if it's a good attunement match, 33% of the time they're going to develop a secure attachment. So that cuts people a lot of slack, because that's not that
very
much.
Helpful. Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah.
So the person who's trying to get
like 1 in 3 times, isn't it? If you're doing a good job in 1 in 3 times, you're doing good.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that will be a very helpful tip. Remember that, HSP parents.
Please remember that.
33% to get a
33%.
secure attachment. Love it. All right. So a little bit on the positive side now. So what's the biggest difference you feel that a parent can make in a HSP child's life?
Well, I think if they're raised in an environment that is validating and strengths-based, they're going to grow into the most amazing people on the planet. I mean, I know that all of us who work on ourselves as adults, like we're trying to undo 20, 30 years of bad, you know, yucky stuff in our own lives. And if our kids don't have to do that, imagine the joy that they'll bring to the world and themselves and all the people they come in contact with. I just think that HSPs there's so many gifts. I mean, our intuition, our creativity, our compassion, I think we're raising this generation to be leaders, to really be the change that's needed in the world today. I mean, you talked in your other workshop about, what a mess the world is right now, and it really is. And that you can get kind of hopeless, I think, as an HSP parent and say, oh, what kind of world is my poor child growing up in? But if we're raising these confident, healthy human beings who are sensitive and attuned to other people and care about the environment, they're gonna be change that we can't even probably imagine. I mean, I can have my own dreams for my daughter and other kids that I know, but I fully believe that they're going to come up with solutions to the problems that we're having right now that we can't even probably imagine right now.
Yeah, I'm just getting goosebumps and getting emotional thinking about it. Like, I honestly think, like, I've got tears, honestly think that they can change the world. Yeah. If we do what we can to raise them in the way that we've been talking about, I think it's like a really exciting, hopeful future for them. Yeah. So that, again, this is why this topic is so important, is because of the potential that they have to literally change the world. I think that's beautiful. All right, I've got another question that was submitted. Okay. So I'll do that before we go into the final thing, which is your 3 tips for parents. Okay. So this is one of the ladies in my group, and she said, I'd love to ask Carolina a question about discipline from an HSP mum to an HSP 9-year-old son. I'm not naturally bossy, so when I have to repeat myself, I get quite frustrated, and my child takes this as anger, even though he waits until this point to take action. He then gets upset and apologizes to me, but by then all I feel is shame and worry that I'm creating fear in him to please me. I often feel bad about this, even though we always talk about it afterwards and hug it out. He knows he's loved. I just wish I knew how to not get so disappointed in myself and feel all this guilt. I didn't expect to be grumpy when I'm so patient with everyone else, and I hate how it feels. Thanks. P.S. I know behind this is a great fear of failure as a parent, obviously.
Oh, well, it's such a beautiful, complex question. I just want to say, I can't imagine you failing, because wow, like, how lucky is your son to have someone who reflects that much on their own process? That's an amazing gift you're giving him. And I would say the only thing that, I mean, obviously being gentle with yourself is really important, like we just talked about, but sharing your process is also really important with your kid. I know, like, I can totally relate as the parent of a toddler with setting a limit and they test it and you have to set it again. That drives me crazy. I get it. So I have learned over time to say it once the first time and say it when I'm still calm, and then say, I don't want to get grumpy with you if they start to do it again, or I'm starting to get grumpy. You know what I've asked you to do, like really holding the limit by expressing what's going on for me, and then setting the limit sooner. Because I think the one thing that we do, because we're so understanding sometimes, is we let them go on a little too long with how it is, and that frustration arises in us. I think it's Brene Brown that talks about how when we don't set boundaries, we get resentful. And I really have taken that to heart, even with my 2-year-old, that I have to set the boundary once. If she crosses it, I have to really enforce it then, so I'll say, you're going to get a timeout if you do that again. And she knows I'm in business, and generally she doesn't push it, and now, unless she's really in a mood, but it takes some practice, but really getting to that place where you set the boundary so that you can stay emotionally regulated, then you won't feel so ashamed that you've gone into this whole like anger and resentment. If you're able to catch it before you get there, that's the one tip I can provide.
Thank you. And I love what you said about sharing the process with them. So kind of saying, mum's getting grumpy now, we don't like it when mum's grumpy. So yeah, I love that, because that I think even in just voicing that would help you regulate yourself as well, because it's bringing it into that conscious awareness. You're talking about it. And then, yeah, I think that's really helpful. Thank you. And so the lady who asked that, I wasn't sure if she wanted me, because she did another comment saying, oh, maybe just make it a general question. So that's why I haven't mentioned her name. But if the lady who asked this has any follow-up questions based on what Carolina said in response to your question, please post them below. And Carolina, I'm sure, will be happy to circle back around and respond if there's any follow-ups. So thank you. That's very helpful advice. So before we finish up, I suppose I just wanted to ask if you have 3 tips for parents listening to this who are raising an HSP child, either for them or for the children, because it's kind of been a 2-pronged conversation.
Yeah, I think I would just summarize what we've said so far, which is being gentle with yourself. That's number 1, not being too critical of yourself, because I think kids really, they see us doing that and then they're more likely to do it. So think of it as modeling, if nothing else, if it's hard for you to do. Number 2 would be really validating their experience, whatever that may be. And number 3 would be communication. I think that goes a lot farther than people think. And as HSPs, we often tend to, we're kind of mind readers in a lot of ways. And so we expect that other people are too, and that sometimes that gets rid of the need for a conversation, but conversation and communication goes such a long way, no matter how young the child is. I've been sharing my process, not oversharing, but like sharing my reasons for things and my thinking behind things since my daughter was born, because I've wanted to practice it myself, to like get used to doing that all the time. And I think the more we're able to voice our own process and our own experience of the relationship and what's happening in it, the better our kids are going to be able to do that. And they're also going to not assume that the problem is with them. They're going to say, oh, mom's saying she's grumpy because she's hungry. That's just one example, but some kids will think, oh, I made mom grumpy, but in fact, I didn't eat enough at lunch and I'm grumpy when I go pick her up. And, so it's important to just keep those lines of communication open all the time, so they don't have to wonder or make assumptions that are going to be incorrect.
Love it. And I just had a thought in terms of the voicing your process. Would you suggest, because I know you're a relationship therapist as well as doing parents, would you suggest that's a relevant thing for just in a relationship, whether it be siblings, partner relationship, just to share your process so that the other person understands better? Is that almost like a general tip that would help us?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's underrated, and it's not something a lot of people have practice at, I've realized. It's the world I live in as a therapist and a coach, but a lot of people aren't used to talking about their feelings. And so the more you practice it, the easier it gets.
And here comes that self-awareness again, because we can't talk about it if we're not aware of them. And I think you're right. It is something that I was quite shocked the other day. I did a guest live in somebody else's group, and I was talking about that, and I was talking about like separating yourself from your thoughts and like becoming an observer of your thoughts and how that ties in with self-awareness. And this was a totally new concept to the lady that had hosted me in her group. And I went, oh, okay, I need to talk about this more, obviously, because it is a skill that you can develop, and it's a very powerful skill. And I think that's where you can really develop your self-awareness as well, is to getting to that point. So yeah, I think that's a really good tip for everybody, not just parents of HSP. So thank you. All right, well, we've pretty much gone through our we've done over an hour already, so wow, that went fast.
Flies.
I reckon time flies when you're having fun. So I just want to finish up before we say goodbye and everything. I just wanted to let you know about an offer that Carolina has made for everybody. So between now and December 31st, so the end of the year, Carolina is offering a 10% discount on coaching packages for anybody who's seen this talk. So all you need to do to access this is book a discovery call, and I'm going to put the link down below. Book a discovery call and let Carolina know that you heard about her through HSP Awareness Week, and that way she'll know that the 10% discount will apply. So thank you for that, Carolina. I know Veronique will probably be getting in touch with you because it sounds like she was really, what you said was really helpful for her. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for being part of the very first HSP-E Awareness Week. And I love that you're starting to learn about us extroverts as well, because that's really exciting. And that's part of why I'm doing this. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was really an honor and a pleasure. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. All right,
Thank
I will
you.
stop the live now. So anybody who's watching this, any comments, any thoughts, any questions, please put them below and we will come back and answer them later on. And if you want to get in touch with Carolina, then I'll put all the links and everything down below. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you all on the next one. All right. Stopping the live stream. I'm stopping the recording now.